After the decisive Battle of Midway, the tables turned in the Pacific theatre. While General MacArthur's forces and Admiral Halsey's fleet were achieving a series of valuable victories in the South and Southwest Pacific areas, a new avenue of offensive approach was being prepared, one that was soon to penetrate the Japanese Empire's inner perimeter like a knife through butter. Admiral Nimitz's Pacific Fleet would play the star role in this endeavour, as the Navy warships paved the way for the Army and Marine troops to jump from island to island in the Central Pacific. Consequently, the island-hopping campaign was born. Yet the Japanese, still licking their wounds from recent defeats, but sensing the looming threat of a possible enemy invasion of their inner empire, were ready to die fighting for islands most people don't know the name of. Their willingness to sacrifice their lives in vain was only matched by their burning desire to take with them as many of the enemy as possible. Thus, a huge confrontation centered around the Gilbert and Marshall Islands was brewing, one in which both sides were certainly set to suffer heavy casualties, but one in which only one side could emerge victorious. The course of the Pacific War was once again about to change, so join us as we cover the start of the island-hopping campaign in its full depth. These long videos are very difficult to make, so we hope you'll give us your comment, like and share, and we'll consider joining our Patreon or YouTube membership, links in the description. This video is sponsored by you. Unfortunately, the YouTube environment is not great right now, with the algorithm being friendlier to drama and react channels and YouTube being permissive of AI slop. We don't do drama and we don't do AI, but thanks to our members and patrons, our channel continues to make 3 public videos per week, with the team intact and going strong. In recognition of their generosity and contributions, members and patrons receive 2 additional exclusive videos each week, and access many other perks. Join them to watch more than 250 exclusive videos covering every era of history. Join them by scanning the QR code on your screen, via the links in the description or pinned comment, or by pressing the join button under the video. Ever since the Casablanca Conference, Admirals King and Nimitz have been analysing the idea of a direct advance west through the Central Pacific towards the line Truk, Guam, particularly against the Marshall Islands. Since the decisive victory at Guadalcanal had allowed the Allies to secure the line of communications with Australia, King took for granted that Rabaul would fall in 1943, and thus wanted to take advantage of his direct thrust through the Central Pacific to seize the Philippines, in the hopes that Japan would be cut off from the vast riches of the Dutch East Indies. To appease their British colleagues, however, General Marshall assured that the Gilberts, Marshalls, Carolines invasions would be undertaken with the resources available in the theatre. But during the Trident Conference of May, which wasn't primarily concerned with Pacific strategy, the Joint Chiefs of Staff submitted the Strategic Plan for the Defeat of Japan, which called for a large, sustained air offensive against the home islands in preparation for a final invasion of Japan. For this purpose, China would have to be maintained, and US and British forces would need to fight their way there in order to secure a good port, preferably Hong Kong. The British, assisted by the Americans and Chinese, were to recapture Burma and make a drive through the Strait of Malacca to Hong Kong via a series of amphibious operations, and meanwhile, the Americans had to drive through the Celebes Sea to Hong Kong from the Central Pacific, aided by subsidiary efforts in the South and Southwest Pacific areas. The Central Pacific was chosen as the most advantageous route of advance because it was much shorter and less roundabout than the southern route, because it would not require as many ships, troops and supplies, because capture of the key bases in the Marshalls, Marianas and Carolinas would isolate Japan from her overseas empire, and because the enemy could only deploy limited air and ground forces in the islands and atolls of the Central Pacific. Although the Central Pacific offensive was regarded as the main effort, American planners ultimately decided to make twin drives along the central and southern axes, which could provide more opportunities for mutual support, and by preventing the Japanese from being able to guess the time and place of forthcoming advances, could keep them strategically off balance. Allocation of forces was also contemplated for this ambitious plan, and thankfully they could hope to receive a huge fleet, many air squadrons and sufficient ground forces. It was expected that by the end of the year, 1 Marine and 3 Army divisions would be in the Central Pacific, The South Pacific would have 2 Marine, 5 US Army, and 1 New Zealand divisions, and in the Southwest Pacific, 4 American infantry, 1 American airborne, 1 Marine, and 11 Australian divisions would be present, of which 3 would be available for offensive operations. According to the Joint Chiefs' estimates, 2 more divisions were thus needed for the Marshalls, 2 more for the Carolines, and 3 more for New Guinea. The strategic plan was finally approved by the Combined Chiefs of Staff on May 22nd, becoming the cornerstone of Pacific strategy for the remainder of 1943 and for 1944. For the planned Central Pacific Offensive, Nimitz decided that his first objective would be the Marshall Islands. Seizure of the Marshalls, it was agreed, was essential for the extension of the line of communications to the Celebes Sea, and would also shorten and secure the routes to Australia. From the Marshalls, land-based aircraft could help support naval surface operations against the enemy's communication lines, and there was always the possibility that an Allied push into the Marshalls would force the Japanese fleet to come out fighting. By July 20th, however, it was decided that instead of directly assaulting the Marshalls, which could be a costly offensive and would certainly require large forces, the Americans should instead capture Nauru and the Gilbert Islands as a preliminary for the invasion of the Marshalls. Thus, Admiral King and General Marshall approved Operation Galvanic, directing Nimitz to invade the Gilberts on November 15th, and to prepare plans for seizing the Marshalls about February 1st, 1944. For this offensive, Nimitz would have at his disposal all surface forces of the Pacific Fleet, most of its naval aircraft, in addition to elements of the 7th Air Force, the 2nd Marine Division, the 27th Division, which needed amphibious training, 3 aviation engineer or construction battalions, 1 port battalion, and 3 Marine Defense battalions. Already in 1943, the 7th Air Force of Major General Willis Hale had carried out some reconnaissance and bombing missions against Nauru and the Gilberts from its bases at Canton and Funafuti. These 2 bases were the only ones within range of the Gilberts, but still they were so far away as to make regular bombing runs difficult and hazardous. In that regard, the Joint Chiefs in July authorized the seizure of other islands for the construction of new airfields from which to conduct neutralization and reconnaissance. Thus, early in August, Nimitz ordered 3 Marine battalions to secure the Ellice Islands. With the 5th Defense Battalion already in Funafuti, Nimitz wanted to build new airfields at Nukufetau and Nanumea, which were respectively about 600 miles south and 350 miles east of Tarawa. An advance party survey therefore landed at Nanumea on August 18th to determine that there was no enemy presence, with the first elements of the 7th Defense Battalion occupying the atoll 10 days later. Meanwhile, on August 22nd, an advance party of the 2nd Airdrome Battalion landed at Nukufetau and was followed 5 days later by the remainder of the battalion. The transformation of these atolls into air bases progressed rapidly. By September 7th, a 5,000-foot airstrip was ready for use at Nanumea, and by the end of the month, a full squadron of planes was operating from there. Work at Nukufetau was somewhat slower, but the strip was ready for use by October 9th. Additionally, on August 11th, the 804th Aviation Engineer Battalion would be sent to develop Baker Island, an American possession about 480 miles due east of the Gilberts. Arriving there on September 1st, it would take only a week for the aviation engineers to build a strip capable of supporting fighter planes. Thus, Nimitz and Hale now had enough bases to prepare for Operation Galvanic. As we'll recall, Admiral Nimitz had been directed to invade the Gilbert Islands on November 15th and to prepare plans for seizing the Marshall Islands around February 1st, 1944. At this point, it is important to note that the US Navy had fully recovered from the damage inflicted at Pearl Harbor, and was now taking advantage of its huge industrial capabilities to build one of the largest fleets that has ever existed. This can be seen in America's impressive numbers. Between the start of the war and the end of 1943, the US would manage to commission a total of 7 aircraft carriers of the new Essex class, 9 light carriers of the new Independence class, 35 escort carriers, 6 battleships, 4 heavy cruisers, 16 light cruisers, 212 destroyers, 234 destroyer escorts, and 92 submarines. In that same period, the Japanese only commissioned 2 aircraft carriers, 1 light carrier, 4 escort carriers, 2 battleships, 4 light cruisers, 22 destroyers, 15 destroyer escorts, and 61 submarines. Thus, the Americans now had enough naval capabilities to pierce into the heart of the Japanese Empire. Planning for Operation Galvanic fell under Vice Admiral Spruance, the commander of the Central Pacific Force. Under his command was the newly formed 5th Amphibious Force of Vice Admiral Turner, a veteran who had planned and conducted the landings at Guadalcanal and the Central Solomons. On September 4th, the 5th Amphibious Corps of Major General Holland Smith was also established to control and train the units assigned to this operation, which included Major General Julian Smith's 2nd Marine Division and Major General Ralph Smith's 27th Division. As the 5th Amphibious Force and Corps were still undergoing organisation during the planning phase of the Gilberts operation, much of the burden of devising tactical plans fell originally to the staffs of the 2 divisions involved. Julian Smith had been told in August that he was to capture the Tarawa and Apamama atolls, so his staff had ample time to prepare its own plans, which were eventually approved with modifications by the Corps commander. Ralph Smith, however, was originally told that he was to invade Nauru, so he made plans accordingly. Yet Holland Smith believed that Nauru offered too many hitherto unsuspected hazards for an amphibious attack at this particular time. Consequently, in early October, Spruance and Nimitz would decide to invade Makin Atoll instead. Unfortunately for the Americans, there wasn't adequate intelligence on the Gilberts, so they had to do a photographic coverage of Tarawa and Makin between July and October. Additionally, highly detailed information was received from a reconnaissance mission of the submarine Nautilus, which contributed meaningful data on hydrographic and beach conditions for both of the main islands. Finally, during September and October, a total of 16 former residents or travellers from the islands were attached to Admiral Turner's staff to supply additional information from memory. For the landings at Makin, Turner had at his disposal 4 APAs, 1 AKA, 1 LSD, and 9 LSTs to bring ashore the reinforced 165th Regiment of Colonel Gardiner Conroy, screened by a force of 4 old battleships, 4 heavy cruisers, 13 destroyers, and 3 escort carriers that were to provide naval gunfire and aerial support. Meanwhile, for the Tarawa landings, Turner assigned 1 AP, 12 APAs, 3 AKAs, 1 LSD, and 12 LSTs under Rear Admiral Harry Hill, screened by a force of 3 battleships, 3 heavy cruisers, 3 light cruisers, 21 destroyers, and 5 escort carriers that also had to bombard the shore at Tarawa. Additionally, Turner made the revolutionary decision of appointing Colonel Eriksson, veteran of the Aleutians campaign, as the commander support aircraft, thus establishing a centralized system of ground control of support aircraft in amphibious operations. Aerial support, both tactical and strategic, was to be provided in the main by Rear Admiral Charles Pownall's Carrier Task Force, which was formed around 6 large and 5 small carriers, and by Rear Admiral John Hoover's shore-based planes. Both forces had to destroy aircraft and air harbour facilities at Tarawa, Meal, Jeluit, Makin and Nauru, as well as providing close air support. But Hoover also had to attack and conduct photographic reconnaissance over the Marshalls. After the airstrikes and the naval gunfire support, which were to obliterate the Japanese defences and installations, Turner planned to assault the beaches with troops carried in amphibian tractors, followed by troops in LCVPs and by medium tanks transported in LCMs. For Makin, Ralph Smith's plan was elaborate in the extreme and unlike any adopted before or since, as it assigned a major role to troops of a different regiment than the one that made up the main landing force. 2 detachments of the 105th Regiment would land first on the west coast of Bataritari, followed quickly by 2 battalions of the 165th, and then by tanks and artillery pieces. Meanwhile, 2 platoons were to land on Katabu Island to secure the eastward approaches into the lagoon. 2 hours later, while the troops consolidated and expanded the beachhead, a 3rd detachment of the 105th was to be put ashore on the north side of the island. The detachment would then split into 2 groups, one heading eastward to clear King's Wharf, and the other westward to clear On Chong's Wharf. following this wave would come the last battalion of the 165th, which was to advance westwards until contact was made with the rest of the regiment. By contrast, Julian Smith's plan was a model of simplicity, calling for the landing of 3 battalions on the north shore of Betio. The troops were drawn up from the 2nd and 8th Marine Regiments, and the 6th Marines being held in Corps Reserve for landings at Tarawa, Makin or Apamama in case of emergency. As soon as the beachhead was secured, the assault troops were to move directly across the island to the south, seizing the airfield and mopping up enemy positions along the ocean beaches. Furthermore, in preparation for Operation Galvanic, Admiral Pownall had led 3 carriers to strike at the Gilberts on September 18th. Supported by 38 B-24s, Pownall would make 6 separate and unopposed attacks against Tarawa, during which 80 tons of bombs were dropped, and all visible installations strafed. One attack was also launched against Makin at daylight, and another against Apamama later in the morning, and Nauru was likewise neutralized. The following day, Pownall tried to strike again, but this time his aircraft would be intercepted by 18 Zeros, suffering 5 losses and shooting down 6 fighters. The raid on the Gilberts was followed 18 days later by a naval carrier strike against Wake. Led by Admiral Montgomery, one of the largest carrier striking forces yet assembled in the Pacific, hit Wake on October 5th and 6th. As a result, 67 Japanese planes were reported destroyed in the air and on the ground, and shore installations were heavily damaged. Then, commencing on November 13th, the land-based bombers of Admiral Hoover made nightly attacks on Tarawa and Makin, as well as on Nauru and islands in the Central Marshalls. Meanwhile, between November 13th and 17th, Major General Willis Hale's heavy bombers also flew a total of 141 bombing sorties against the Gilberts and Marshalls, dropping about 173 tons of bombs, destroying at least 5 enemy aircraft and inflicting heavy damage on the enemy facilities and installations. Against the Americans, Japanese forces in the area originally came from Rear Admiral Abe Koso's 6th Base Force at Kwajalein, which had 1 naval detachment at Nauru, 1 naval detachment at Ocean Island, and only 1 naval detachment at Makin. But after the raid on Makin of 1942, the Japanese would realize the true importance of these islands, immediately sending the 6th Yokosuka SNLF to occupy the Gilberts. Throughout the winter and early spring of 1943, new steps were then taken to improve defences in the Gilberts, such as the creation of Rear Admiral Shibazaki Keiji's 3rd Special Base Force, which was made responsible for the defence of Tarawa, Makin, Apamama, Nauru and Ocean Island, the arrival of the Sasebo 7th SNLF at Tarawa and of the 2nd Yokosuka SNLF at Nauru, and the construction of fortifications and airfields on Makin and Tarawa. Elsewhere in the Central Pacific, the Marshalls, the Marianas, the Carolines and some other islands were also reinforced in preparation for the expected American offensives, with the formation of 4 new South Seas detachments and 2 mobile amphibious brigades that could be employed to make counter-landings. Furthermore, the 13th Division was also prepared to reinforce the Marianas and the 52nd Division to reinforce Truk, which were set to arrive in 1944. Though the Japanese were outnumbered in every aspect, they were ready to fight to the last and to die with glory in defense of these fortified islands. The plans for Operation Galvanic, the invasion of the Gilberts, were finally ready. As a preliminary, the Americans had carried out a series of carrier-borne and land-based airstrikes against the Gilberts and the Marshalls that managed to inflict heavy damage on the enemy facilities and installations on these islands. On November 10th, Admiral Turner's Northern Attack Force finally left Pearl Harbor to begin the long trek towards the Gilberts, and after some rehearsals at Afate, Admiral Hill's Southern Attack Force also sortied from that island on November 13th, moving in a northerly direction to a rendezvous with Turner on November 18th. During the 2 days before the landings, both Navy and Army planes delivered last-minute softening-up blows against Nauru and Mile, which were effectively neutralized, and against Makin and Tarawa, which suffered extensive damage. Cruisers and destroyers also moved close to Tarawa shortly before noon on November 19th and bombarded ground defences between airstrikes. One of the most important effects of the heavy air raids was that the Japanese wasted a considerable amount of their precious ammunition against these aerial attacks. The heavy expenditure of 13mm machine gun ammunition was particularly important, since these weapons were to form the main basis of ground fire defense. Then, in the early hours of November 20th, the two attack forces reached their separate destinations. The transports moved towards their debarkation areas, and the fire support ships moved to shore for the initial bombardment. In the dim light of the early morning, the invasion of Batari and Betio began. In the north, arriving on station off Red Beach at 0603, the transports commenced to lower their boats, while the carrier aircraft bombed and strafed the western beaches. As they drew away at 0640, naval guns of the accompanying battleships, cruisers and destroyers opened fire and kept up a steady rain of shells until 0825, which was then followed by a 5-minute strafing attack. At the same time, the 165th Regiment's men embarked on LZVPs, and the amphibian tractors carrying the 105th Regiment detachments began to arrive. Then, at 0815, the tractors started to head for the beach, firing with their rockets and machine guns against a non-existent opposition, with the LZVPs following close behind them. Finally, at 0831, the tractors hit the beach and the men began to scramble ashore, successfully securing a beachhead. Following the tractors came the first 3 waves of landing craft at about 5-minute intervals, which were hampered by a studded reef with coral boulders about 40 yards offshore. In the confusion, most of the craft were broached, stranded, or forced to put to sea again, and those that made it found it difficult to withdraw and allow later assault waves to land. The tanks, waterproofed for the landing, rolled off the ramps into the water, and the men struggled in swells, sometimes over their heads, and sought cover at the edge of the beach. At best, only 3 boats could be landed at one time, and the 5th wave was not able to get ashore until 10 o'clock, over an hour behind schedule. Against them, the Japanese counted with an estimated 798 men, under Lieutenant Seizo Ishikawa, only including 284 combat troops, with the rest being labourers, mostly from Korea. Ishikawa had established a perimeter defence around the seaplane base on the lagoon shore, with 3 dual-purpose 8cm guns at the base of King's Wharf and a few machine guns. Running from the lagoon to the ocean were also 2 tank barrier systems, each partially guarded by strands of tripwire and covered by anti-tank guns, machine guns and rifle pits. Luckily for General Smith, Ishikawa's defences were between the 2 tank barriers, as the Japanese expected that any invasion of the island would be made there. Under any kind of enemy fire, the natural obstacles to the American landing on the western side of the island would have proved catastrophic for the attacking troops. Further south, Admiral Shibazeki had a total of 4,836 men on Betio Island, of which 2,619 were combat troops. Betio itself had been built into an island fortress of the most formidable aspect, bristling with guns of all calibers, well protected in emplacements of steel, concrete and thick coconut logs, and with the entire island being organised for an all-round decisive defence at the beach. Inshore, organisation for defence was more haphazard, with bomb-proof ammunition and personnel shelters being used as defensive positions in depth. There, the Japanese were blind to attack from several directions, and since they had not been designed as blockhouses, they only had a few firing ports. Nonetheless, the combination of beach guns, anti-tank ditches, beach barricades and other obstacles made Tarawa the most heavily defended atoll that would ever be invaded by the Allied forces in the Pacific. In the early hours of November 20th, Admiral Hill's transports arrived west of Betio, immediately starting to lower their boats. With the approach of daylight at 0550, however, it became apparent that the transports were too far to the south, which brought the transports within range of the enemy's coastal guns. As the convoy had been detected by patrol planes the day before, the Japanese had had time to prepare for defense, and at 0441, Shibazeki ordered the garrison to prepare to fire. 26 minutes later, a coastal battery on the western end of Betio opened up, but caused little damage. American warships returned fire immediately, rapidly destroying one enemy gun, which forced the Japanese to take cover. The naval gunfire continued until 0542, with airstrikes being carried out afterward at 0613. Meanwhile, the transports were moving north to safer berths under heavy enemy fire. and at the same time, 2 minesweepers and 2 destroyers fought their way into the Tarawa Lagoon, successfully finding no mines, though the destroyer, Ringgold, suffered moderate damage during this action. Choppy seas, a strong headwind, and a receding tide also delayed the arrival of the amphibian tractors, so the landings were delayed until 0900. By 0855, the tractors were still late, but Hill ceased all naval gunfire anyway, as the tractors were starting to approach. The volume of fire that fell upon the tractors as they waddled over the reef towards the beach was so heavy that it caused considerable disorganization in the 3 waves. The first of the tractors finally hit the beach at 0910, landing ashore the 3rd Battalion 2nd Marines on Red Beach 1 under heavy enemy fire. Moving steady, the Marines soon hit a log barricade and began to infiltrate the island. Yet Company K had taken so many casualties already that it was unable to move past it. By 1100, although Company K managed to push a few men over the coconut barrier, the 2 leading companies had suffered 50% casualties, and the reserve company L, which was still landing to the east, lost about 35% of its strength before reaching the beach. Furthermore, a tank platoon was soon landed, but 4 of them fell into potholes in the coral reef and were drowned out. Meanwhile, at 0922, the 2nd Battalion 2nd Marines also landed in confusion on Red Beach 2 under heavy enemy fire, suffering heavy casualties as well. Company F was decimated on the way to the shore, but still managed to land on the left half of the beach, successfully digging in the coral sand. Suffering heavy casualties, Company E was dispersed during the landing. The reserve Company G landed in the center, but was also immediately pinned down, and other units even landed dispersed on Red Beach 1. Huddled along the coconut log barrier, moving only when necessary, the battalion turned its efforts to eliminating the enemy positions that jutted out onto the beach itself. Further east, at 0917, the 2nd Battalion 8th Marines likewise landed on Red Beach 3 under devastating fire, yet they enjoyed more success thanks to the naval bombardment effort. Only suffering 25 casualties, the battalion rapidly broke through the log barricade, with Company E advancing as far inland as the main airstrip. Yet the troubles that the 2nd Marines were facing soon forced Colonel David Shoup to commit his reserve 1st Battalion, which was ordered to land on Red Beach 2, and work to the west towards Red Beach 1 in an attempt to assist the 3rd Battalion in that area. Thus, by 1100, 2 companies were sent forward in amphibious tractors, suffering the same fire that had decimated the other waves, but eventually wading ashore to join the beleaguered Marines. When General Smith heard about Shoup's call for reinforcements, he also decided to commit his reserve 3rd Battalion 8th Marines to reinforce the right flank. Boated in LCVPs, the battalion could not proceed further than the reef line, and finally waded ashore under heavy fire by early afternoon. Furthermore, as supply barges were unable to reach the beaches, the reserve troops had to carry some of the more vitally needed supplies. At the same time, aided by 2 M4 Sherman tanks, the battered 3rd Battalion 2nd Marines started a drive across the island towards the south shore. Working from shelter to shelter, small detachments made steady progress, eventually getting within 300 yards of the south shore when the 2 tanks were knocked out by 40mm gunfire. This progress allowed Major Michael Ryan to discover that part of Green Beach on the west coast of Betio was available for landing reserves. Unable to relay this to Shoup, however, he ultimately had to withdraw into a more compact defensive position by 1800. It's important to note that, at this point, Admiral Shibazaki and all of his senior officers had been killed by 5-inch naval gunfire, which essentially left the Japanese leaderless. Lacking in offensive leadership, the demoralized and uncoordinated defenders would then show little inclination to counterattack during the critical first 2 days of the battle. Concurrently, the 8th Marines continued to consolidate its hard-earned gains, with Company F engaging in vicious combat with the ferocious defenders at Burnsville Wharf, and successfully breaking up one tank-supported Japanese counterattack by nightfall. Right next to them, Shoup's forces on Red Beach 2 remained disorganized and scrambled, with some small detachments having penetrated inland, while others were still pinned down at the water's edge. Throughout the night, carrying parties worked to get supplies ashore, as few supplies had actually gotten to the beaches. Meanwhile, at Makin, Admiral Turner had been able to land the 1st and 3rd Battalions, 169th Regiment, which now had to secure the beachhead. Upon landing, the bulk of the 2 battalions moved directly forward towards the beachhead line, about 1,300 yards inland, meeting only insignificant rifle fire. By 10:30, the beachhead line had been secured. Company A and Detachment Y had been dispatched northward to occupy Flink Point, and Company L, assisted by Detachment X, had turned south to take Ukiangong village and to clear the whole point beyond it. Although General Smith expected some resistance at Ukiangong, the point was secured without opposition, so he immediately started preparations to establish artillery positions there. And by 12:40, Flink Point was also secured, so the landing operation had been a complete success. But in the meantime, after receiving word at 0800 that the Katabu detachment had taken that island without opposition, Turner decided to go ahead with the landings at Yellow Beach. At 10:05, as the landing forces moved towards Yellow Beach, the destroyers McDonough and Phelps opened fire with their 5-inch guns. Once again, amphibian tractors led the approach, firing with their rockets against the beach. At 10:35, with the tractors still about 600 yards off the beach, the 2 destroyers ceased firing to allow a last-minute strafing run by the carrier planes. As they made their final approach, the men in the tractors crouched low as they came under heavy enemy fire, but finally managed to hit the beach at 10:41. Upon disembarking, the Americans worked their way inland by crawling along the western slope of the causeway, which masked them from enemy fire, and eventually forced the Japanese to retreat. With the pier captured, Detachment C divided in 2 to take King's Wharf and Onchong's Wharf. The former fell without a contest, but Onchong's Wharf, although beaten to kindling wood, still offered some cover to the enemy. Consequently, the 105th Regiment soldiers had to fight their way through some dugouts or bomb-proof shelters, finally capturing the wharf by dusk. Meanwhile, Turner proceeded to land some 15 medium tanks, though 2 of them would founder in the shell holes in the reef. The remaining made their way to the ocean shore of the island, then split up and moved east and west against the 2 tank barriers. Unfortunately, there was no effective coordination between tanks and infantry, with the tanks operating independently. Behind the tanks came the troops of the 2nd Battalion 165th Regiment, boated in LCVPs that were once again grounded on the reef. At this point, it appeared that the main source of enemy fire was coming from 2 battered and scuttled hulks near Onchong's Wharf, and after a failed attempt to eliminate them, the landings would have to be interrupted from 11:25 to 12:50 while carrier planes bombed and strafed the hulks. Additionally, the destroyer Dewey opened fire on these targets, scoring a couple of hits, but ultimately being ordered to cease firing at 12:07 because it was also hitting American troops on land. Finally, at 12:57, Major Dennis Clare ordered an immediate stop to the air bombardment to continue with the landings of later waves. He would then lead the reinforced Company E to head east towards the East Tank Barrier, meeting little resistance, until being stopped just southwest of King's Wharf. Held up for 4 hours by a tunnel that ran some 35 yards south, connecting a well-fortified pit to a concrete pillbox, the Americans would unsuccessfully employ bazookas and rifle grenades, eventually calling an artillery barrage on the position. Afterwards, through a daring encirclement maneuver, the Japanese in the tunnel were finally killed, so Company E at last dug in for the night. Upon landing, the reinforced Company F initially sent 2 platoons directly across the atoll and then headed westwards for the West Tank Barrier. Its initial move south encountered no resistance, but was handicapped by vegetation. By noon, they had reached the ocean shore, and at 12:30, supported by 5 Sherman tanks, Company F jumped off for the main attack westward. Encountering much opposition from a number of underground shelters, the company advanced fiercely, and finally reached the barrier by 13:30. To the north, a platoon also set forward, but found the going tougher, successfully clearing an important air raid shelter, but ultimately getting pinned down. Yet the timely arrival of another platoon soon allowed the Americans to eliminate the 3 enemy machine gun positions, with 3 tanks then piercing the barrier without encountering any serious opposition. Meanwhile, the 1st Battalion was also advancing from the west, eventually getting past Joan Lake by 1400. Though Company C then ran into a strong machine gun post 150 yards west of the barrier, Company B decided to reach the barrier with speed and rapidly made contact with Company F. At this point, Colonel Conroy, the regimental commander, was shot in the head and died, thus leaving Lieutenant Colonel Gerard Kelly in command. His first orders were for Company C to bypass the pocket in front, while Company A advanced forward to reinforce Company B. The Japanese defenders, meanwhile, were now trapped in the center and were being gradually eliminated by the 4 tanks in that area. By 1755, after Company F had finally destroyed the last of the enemy in the center of its line, contact between the 2 battalions extended the length of the barrier. With the loss of 25 killed and 62 wounded, the 27th Division had gained a good foothold on Bataritari, and the West Tank barrier had been reduced, yet there were still enemy forces in the east that needed to be cleared. On November 21st, after an uneasy night, Kelly directed his 1st Battalion to clear the remaining enemy pocket west of the barrier, while the West Tank barrier area was finally mopped up. To the east, after an air bombardment of the area in front, Major Clare resumed his advance eastwards at 11:10. Supported by 10 Shermans, the Americans advanced slowly but steadily against stiff resistance, successfully overrunning every enemy defensive position that was encountered, and pushing some 1,000 yards by 1700 at the cost of 18 killed and 15 wounded. The following day, the 3rd Battalion relieved Clare's forces, and then attacked the East Tank barrier, while 2 small detachments were dispatched to cut off the Japanese line of retreat. Supported by artillery and tanks, the 3rd Battalion successfully destroyed the enemy positions below Stone Pier, and then struck at the barrier, which had been abandoned during the night. Pushing eastward, the 3rd Battalion's tanks soon linked up with the Company A detachment, yet no enemy forces had been found. 2,100 yards beyond the narrow neck of the island, the Americans finally dug in for the night. Yet, shortly after dark, the remaining Japanese carried out a series of uncoordinated small unit attacks against both Kuma Island and against the 3rd Battalion in an effort to unnerve the Americans. Though shaken, the Americans met them with bullets, successfully killing over 60 Japanese. And during the morning of November 23rd, the attackers finally wiped out the few remaining enemy troops, therefore securing full control of Makin. Total battle casualties for the Americans came to 218, while the Japanese casualties were estimated to be 800 men, including 105 prisoners of war. In the view of the tremendous superiority of American ground forces to those of the enemy, and the comparatively weak state of the Japanese defenses, the ratio of American combat casualties to those of Japanese combat troops was remarkably high. With the battle concluded, most of the 27th Division departed Makin on November 24th, and then left the island in charge of Colonel Clesentenny's garrison forces. But that same morning, the escort carrier Liscombe Bay was sunk by the Japanese submarine I-175, which had arrived near Makin just a few hours before. This action left 644 killed, including Rear Admiral Henry Mullenix, among many others seriously wounded and burned. Thus, the cost of taking Makin was remarkably high. Meanwhile, on Tarawa, the Marines were surprised that no Japanese counterattack developed during the first night. This allowed General Smith to land his reserve 1st Battalion 8th Marines on Red Beach 2 by late morning, although at a high cost as well. In the center of Betio, with support from the deadly artillery, Colonel Shoup's Marines had also consolidated a line just short of the taxiway on the airfield, and began to move men into the triangle formed by the taxiway and airstrip, where a few isolated individuals had spent the night. Other units, led by his 1st Battalion, also began a drive towards the south shore of Betio. When ready, the 1st Battalion 8th Marines launched an attack against the stubbornly defended position at the juncture of the 2 right-hand beaches to re-establish contact with the 3rd Battalion 2nd Marines. To the left, this unit also launched a drive all the way across the island that managed to secure Green Beach, and to the right, the 8th Marines were unable to make any progress against the staunch Japanese opposition. The success of this day finally allowed General Smith to land the reserve 1st and 2nd Battalions 6th Marines in the afternoon, one on Green Beach and the other on Bairiki Island, where no opposition was encountered. At this point, Colonel Edson had landed on Red Beach 2 to assume command of the Marine forces. Early the next morning, a battalion of Marine artillery went ashore on Bairiki to provide supporting fire for the advance. Jumping off at 0800, the 1st Battalion 6th Marines struck eastwards in the south, rapidly reaching the 2nd Marines line at 1100 before pushing further east. During the afternoon of November 22nd, the rest of the 3rd Battalion 6th Marines landed at Green Beach and began moving up in the rear of the assault. Elsewhere on Betio, the 8th Marines also made considerable progress, successfully reducing the strong Burnsville Wharf position, although its 1st Battalion met firm resistance as it kept pushing west. In the east, Colonel Maurice Holmes's 6th Marines then relieved the 8th Marines on the front. By nightfall, General Smith landed at last, as Colonel Holmes prepared to lead his forces on a final drive to the eastern tip of Betio Island. At the same time, however, about 50 Japanese unexpectedly launched a counterattack, initially breaking through the Marine lines, but then getting encircled by Holmes's 1st Battalion. A second and third attack then saw the remainder of the Japanese garrison get wiped out by artillery and machine gun fire in another of their characteristic banzai charges. Thus, the Americans would be able to reach the eastern tip of Betio Island on November 23rd, meeting little resistance. By 10 o'clock, the 1st Battalion 8th Marines and the 3rd Battalion 2nd Marines had also joined up to form a semicircular attack upon the last enemy pocket, finally destroying the last Japanese presence on the island. The capture of Tarawa yielded an estimated 4,690 Japanese killed, and 17 Japanese and 129 Korean prisoners of war. Marine Corps casualties totaled 3,301, including 1,009 killed, 2,101 wounded, and 191 missing in action. November 24th would then see the rest of the Tarawa Atoll get mopped up, and on November 29th, the Abayang, Maracay, and Mariana atolls were also occupied. In the early morning of November 21st, the V Amphibious Corps Reconnaissance Company had also landed on Apamama, successfully crushing any Japanese resistance by November 24th, and thus bringing Operation Galvanic to a successful conclusion. With the invasion of the Gilberts, the Central Pacific Offensive, more commonly known as the Island Hopping Campaign, had started at last. Most of the American senior officers were happy about the success achieved at Makin and Tarawa, since their capture allowed the effective employment of land-based aircraft against the Marshalls because of their close proximity. Naval Seabees and 7th Air Force engineers had rapidly landed upon completion of the fighting, immediately commencing work on airfield construction at Tarawa and Makin. Only one major officer, General Holland Smith, considered that the invasion was not worthy because of how many casualties the Americans had sustained for an island that was not that important, including one escort carrier sunk and 1,772 killed. Yet the invasion also taught many valuable lessons, such as how to improve the preliminary naval fire and airstrikes to be more effective, the capability of naval fleets to move into an area, obtain complete naval and air control of that area, and remain there with acceptable losses throughout the entire assault and preliminary consolidation phases, which would form the basis for all subsequent operations in the Central Pacific. The importance of maintaining good communications between land and sea, and between tanks and infantry, which in this case had been deficient, and the value of amphibian tractors when you had to assault fortified beaches, which made them completely indispensable. Most importantly, Operation Galvanic proved to be a significant testing ground of established amphibious doctrine, which left the Americans no doubt that the techniques, tactics, and procedures set forth in the basic US manuals for landing operations were workable even under the most difficult conditions. On the other hand, although the Japanese initially prepared the Co Brigade at Ponape to carry out a counter-landing against the Gilberts, this idea would be rapidly dropped, and many efforts would be made to reinforce their other Central Pacific possessions, particularly those at the Marshalls. Plans for the invasion of the Marshall Islands had been well underway even before the successful liberation of the Gilberts. For this task, codenamed Operation Flintlock, Admiral Nimitz had been assigned the 4th Marine Division, the reinforced 22nd Marine Regiment, and the Army's 7th Division, units that required intensive training in amphibious warfare. In addition, he counted with the bulk of the Pacific Fleet, including a grand total of 23 aircraft carriers, 15 battleships, 18 cruisers, and 109 destroyers. Vice Admiral Sprotz, now designated Commander 5th Fleet, would have the highest operational command for Flintlock. Admiral Turner in turn would command Task Force 51, the Joint Expeditionary Fleet, and General Holland Smith would command Task Force 56, which included all expeditionary troops. They were also to be supported by Rear Admiral Mark Mitzger's Fast Carrier Force and by Admiral Hoover's land-based air forces, which included the 7th Air Force and other Navy air forces. Nimitz's original plan was to advance into the Marshalls by the simultaneous seizure of the Kwajalein, Maloelap and Wotje atolls, which contained about 65% of the aircraft facilities in the island group. The remaining 35%, located on Gilbert and Marshall, could then be neutralized and bypassed. Yet by September of 1943, having learnt of all the difficulties of the Gilberts operation, Nimitz decided to bypass Maloelap and Wotje as well, therefore concentrating all his forces against Kwajalein. This decision was opposed by General Holland Smith and Vice Admirals Spruance and Turner, who argued that the shipping moving into Kwajalein would be too exposed if Maloelap and Wotje were left unoccupied. Yet Nimitz's boldness would eventually prove that the fear of danger from his more cautious advisors was unnecessary. As such, Nimitz's new plan was for General Corlett's 7th Division to take the southern group of islands in the atoll, including Kwajalein Island, while Major General Harry Smith's 4th Marine Division captured Roi-Namur and the other northern islands of the atoll. Task Force 52, under Turner's direct command, was to transport the 7th Division towards the southern islands, while Rear Admiral Richard Connolly's Task Force 53 brought Schmidt's Marines to the northern islands. After some discussion, Spruance also secured the invasion of Majuro, which was to be carried out by Lieutenant Colonel Frederick Sheldon's Sundance Landing Force, consisting of the 5th Amphibious Corps Reconnaissance Company and the 2nd Battalion 106th Regiment, with the 1st Defence Battalion attached. Spruance wanted the atoll at the earliest possible moment as a fleet base, and he believed that airfields constructed there would help cover the line of communications to Kwajalein. To support the main landings, Mitzger's Fast Carrier Force was to destroy enemy aircraft and air facilities at Wotje, Maloelap, Roi-Namur and Kwajalein, while his own vessels, coordinated with cruisers from Turner's Task Force and Rear Admiral Ernest Small's Neutralization Group, to deliver surface bombardment against these targets. His main objective, however, was to neutralize Eniwetok's dangerous airfield. Meanwhile, Hoover's land-based planes were to keep Marshall and Gilberts neutralized, destroy enemy aircraft and air facilities at Roi-Namur, Kwajalein and Maloelap, mine the waters around Gilbert, Marshall, Maloelap and Wotje, attack enemy ships and shipping in the area, and be responsible for the photographic reconnaissance of the Marshalls. As such, following the seizure of Makin and Tarawa, Hoover's aircraft continued operations against the various important Marshalls atolls without interruption. During November and December, 2 atolls received more attacks than the others. Marshall, nearest to the Gilberts and therefore more easily reached and immediately dangerous, was the centre of attention, but Maloelap, with its large air facilities, had to be kept under constant surveillance and attack. Then, starting on December 23rd, planes based in the Gilberts began to strike more deeply and more powerfully into the Marshalls. On Marshall, between November 24th and December 18th, 106 heavy bombers dropped a total of 122 tons of bombs on the runways and installations. In the next week, American attack bombers and land-based fighters also began to strike the atoll, successfully destroying all fuel dumps, leveling all buildings, destroying 11 planes on the ground and a further 13 interceptors in the air. Consequently, Marshall was neutralized and the Japanese abandoned its airfield in January. On Maloelap, between November 26th and January 10th, B-24s bombed the atoll with mixed results. Damage to the Maloelap base was extensive but not crippling, and runways were never put entirely out of operation. From January 11th to January 25th, the Americans then launched heavier strikes with B-25s against Maloelap, successfully destroying its ground installations but never truly neutralizing its airfield, which continued to dispatch interceptors against the attackers. On January 26th, however, 9 B-25s and 12 P-40s attacked Maloelap, completely catching the Japanese by surprise and destroying its full air strength in one fell swoop. From this point onward, the defenders would not offer any more resistance, and the atoll would be neutralized. During this period, Gilbert was also subjected to 15 attacks, which reduced it to rubble, and Wotje was likewise attacked 14 times, suffering much damage as a result. In the meantime, Admiral Pownall's strike force struck Kwajalein on December 5th, sending a total of 246 aircraft to attack the atoll. As a result, 19 Japanese interceptors and 4 bombers were destroyed at Roi-Namur, 7 cargo ships were destroyed at Kwajalein, and extensive damage had been inflicted on both bases. At the same time, 29 aircraft attacked Wotje, where they destroyed 5 planes on the ground and set fire to hangars, machine shops and barracks. Japanese interceptors, however, would counterattack against Pownall's carriers, and although no serious damage was inflicted, a second strike would be effectively prevented by this daring counterattack. Following this attack, Hoover's planes would continue to pound Kwajalein, carrying out a total of 10 attacks and dropping almost 110 tons of bombs on the atoll. Roi-Namur's airfield, however, would still be in operation by January 29th, although the Japanese were left only with a handful of planes to face the upcoming offensive. The American forces of Admiral Nimitz and Vice Admiral Sprotz were finally ready to launch Operation Flintlock, the invasion of the Marshall Islands. Its first phase was the capture of Kwajalein, with General Corlitt's 7th Division attacking the southern group of islands in the atoll, including Kwajalein Island, while General Schmidt's 4th Marine Division captured Roi-Namur and the other northern islands of the atoll. Furthermore, prior to this attack, Colonel Sheldon's Sundance landing force was also to seize Majuro Atoll. Admiral Turner's plan called for extensive pre-landing bombardment, both from surface ships and from the air. As such, most of the Marshall's airfields had been successfully neutralized by Admiral Hoover's aircraft in the prior months. And to complete the preliminary operations, Admiral Mitzger's fast carrier group was to launch a heavy strike on January 29th. Surface bombardment followed by airstrikes were also to be carried out on January 30th, and then on January 31st, initial landings had to be made on islands adjacent to Kwajalein and Roi-Namur, upon which artillery could be emplaced for the main assaults. Finally, on February 1st, and as many destroyers as could be spared, were to conduct bombardments in support of the main landings. Additionally, commencing 45 minutes before the first wave touched shore, airstrikes by the maximum available number of planes were to be carried out against the main landing beaches. These were to cease 25 minutes before the first wave touched shore, in order to allow a resumption of the ship's fire and artillery fire from Carlson, Ivan and Jacob Islands. With this tremendous bombardment by aircraft, surface ships and artillery, all to be executed before the first troops hit the shoreline, it was hoped that the bitter experience of Tarawa would not be repeated. For the attack on Kwajalein Island, Corlitt decided to land on a narrow front on the beaches at the western extremity, as the reef and surf conditions were more favourable there. He was assigned a total of 79 amphibian tanks and 95 amphibian tractors to carry the first 4 waves of assault troops onto the southern beaches. First, with the greatest secrecy, a small detachment would carry out a pre-dawn landing on the Carter and Cecil Islands. Then the 17th Regiment would be landed on Carlos and Carlson Islands in order to secure General Arnold's artillery emplacements. Finally, the 184th and 32nd Regiments would land abreast on Kwajalein's western tip, and then proceed directly up the axis of the island. If it became evident that operations there were going well, and the reserve 17th Regiment would not be needed, the capture of the remaining islands could proceed. Meanwhile, for the attack on Roi-Namur, Smith's first phase was to capture 5 islets near Roi-Namur. The 25th Marines would first seize Jacob and Ivan Islands to establish thereon 2 Marine artillery battalions, and then they would move to Albert, Allen and Abraham Islands, where the other 2 battalions of the Marine Artillery Regiment were to be emplaced. For the main landings, Schmidt decided to undertake an orthodox amphibious maneuver and land 2 regiments abreast on a broad front on the lagoon shore. The 23rd Marines on Roy's Red Beaches 2 and 3, and the 24th Marines on Namur's Green Beaches 1 and 2. The third and final phase of the operation would include capture of the remaining islands in northern Kwajalein, and would be conducted in order depending upon the speed with which the main objectives were attained. On the other side, the 6th Base Force, now under the command of Admiral Akiyama, had been reinforced with a number of army units, including the 3rd South Sea Garrison at Wake, the 1st South Seas Detachment at Mil and Gilberts, and the 1st Amphibious Mobile Brigade at Eniwetok. As we can see, these reinforcements were distributed mostly on the periphery, as Kwajalein, Gilbert, Maloelap and Worcester already had sizable naval garrisons. The hub of Japanese military activity in the Marshalls was at Kwajalein, with its main airbase at Roi. As it was far away from the Gilberts, with Jelluit, Meal, Maloelap and Watcher standing in the way, an American amphibious landing on Kwajalein was discounted by most Japanese as only a remote possibility. Thus the base was fortified accordingly. The three most heavily defended islands of the atoll were Roi-Namur, Kwajalein and Burton, in that order of strength. Roi-Namur was somewhat better fortified than Kwajalein Island, but neither approached Tarawa as to the size and number of weapons or the construction and concentration of positions. Japanese tactical doctrine still stressed beachline defense to the neglect of defense in depth, but after the experience at Tarawa, they at least shifted their emphasis from defending the ocean shores to defending the lagoon beaches of the islands. Akiyama counted with some 5,000 men on Kwajalein, with about 930 army troops, 250 SNLF Marines, and about 1,150 naval troops from the 61st Guard Unit, and Akiyama's headquarters. The rest were not considered combat effective, mostly comprising labourers and logistical units. Most of these units were at Kwajalein itself, with some 345 troops and over 2,000 air personnel of the 24th Air Flotilla at Roi-Namur. 3 lookout stations were also established on Bennett, Carter and Carlos Islands, while an air unit of 160 men defended Burton. By January 20th, all preparations in the Hawaiian Islands for the invasion of the Marshalls were completed. 2 days later, the task forces would begin to sail towards their final objective. At dawn on January 29th, the 4 task groups of Task Force 58 and the Neutralization Group arrived into the first attack positions assigned to them. Despite squally weather and overcast skies, aircraft from the carriers Enterprise, Yorktown and Belleau Wood would successfully strike and neutralize Tarawa, while planes from Essex, Intrepid and Cabot bombed and strafed Roi-Namur, finally destroying Akiyama's remaining aircraft there. Additionally, the carriers Saratoga, Princeton and Langley sent a succession of flights against Watcher and likewise managed to neutralize its airfield. Finally, Admiral Sherman's carriers, which had sortied from Funafuti, took position southwest of Kwajalein and carried out extensive strafing and bombing operations on the island. The airstrikes from the various task groups were supplemented by naval bombardment from battleships, cruisers and destroyers in the carrier groups, and Hoover's land-based aircraft also joined in the general attack. As the carrier planes retired at dusk, the neutralization group finally shelled Watcher and Maloelap, while Sherman moved northwestward to prepare for a strike on Eniwetok, the last operational airfield still remaining. As such, Sherman's fighters and bombers attacked the atoll on the morning of January 30th and virtually destroyed all its buildings and runways, though a few planes there would escape destruction. The rest of the day would see more carrier strikes and surface bombardments against the Marshall's atolls, while the landing forces made their final approach towards Kwajalein. In the meantime, Admiral Hill's attack group split off from the main task force and headed towards the Majuro atoll. At about 2300, a reconnaissance platoon landed in rubber boats on Kwajalein Island, making them the first American troops to land on any territory that Japan had possessed since before the war. The rest of the reconnaissance company soon landed on other islands and found the Japanese had abandoned the atoll a year earlier. Consequently, Sheldon's landing force occupied Darrett and Delop Islands without opposition, and the 1st Defense Battalion soon arrived to garrison the atoll. To the northwest, meanwhile, 2 destroyer transports raced ahead of Turner's task force towards Carter and Cecil Islands, guarding the lagoon's entrance. There, 2 composite companies were to land during the early hours of January 31st. Whereas Troop B successfully landed on Carter at 0620 and rapidly secured the island by killing its 20 defenders, Troop A accidentally landed on Chauncey Islet at 0545. Upon realizing they had landed on the wrong island, the Americans left a detachment of 61 infantrymen and then re-embarked at 0929. Finally, Troop A landed on Cecil at 1235, finding no opposition there. On Chauncey, however, the Americans discovered a force of over 100 Japanese hidden in the islet's center. Half of the enemy force was killed, but the Americans would eventually have to withdraw after losing 2 men. The desperate Japanese would continue to resist until eventually annihilated a few days later. With the lagoon's entrance secured, Colonel Zimmerman transferred his 2 assault battalions to amphibious tractors and sent them towards Carlos and Carlson Islands. While Kwajalein, Burton and Beverly Islands suffered a sustained bombardment, the 1st Battalion 17th Regiment landed unopposed on Carlos at 0910 and quickly reduced the 25-man Japanese garrison. To the south, the 2nd Battalion landed on the northeast end of Carlson at 09:12 under some artillery fire from Kwajalein that was quickly suppressed by air and naval gunfire. Though some resistance was expected, the Japanese fled, leaving only 21 Koreans, who were taken prisoner. Then General Arnold's 5 artillery battalions were landed, and were subsequently in place by nightfall. Further north, Brigadier General James Underhill had also begun operations against the Ivan and Jacob Islands in order to secure artillery emplacements and an entrance to the lagoon. After a preparatory bombardment, the Marines boarded the Amtraks with difficulty due to the headwind and choppy seas. Nonetheless, the Amtrak waves began to move forward at 09:17, with LCI gunboats leading. After a rocket barrage, B Company of the 25th Marines came ashore on Jacob at 09:52 and overran the island in 15 minutes. For the invasion of Ivan, however, surf, winds and reef conditions slowed the Amtraks. Consequently, a tank company was sent to swing south around the islet into the lagoon and land through the calmer surf. It successfully landed at 09:55, with Company C of the 25th Marines landing on the opposite northwest shore at 10:15, followed by Company A. After linking up, the Marines moved up the island, rapidly destroying the enemy's token resistance and successfully securing Ivan by 11:45. By early afternoon, the 3rd Battalion 14th Marines had been carried ashore to Jacob Island in LVTs, and the 4th Battalion was landed on Ivan from LCMs. With the lagoon's entrance secure, the 2nd and 3rd Battalions 25th Marines were then directed to land on Albert and Allen. Again, rough seas delayed the transfer to the Amtraks, which became scattered and needed to be rounded up. Eventually, the Marines began to move forward, with LCI gunboats firing their rockets and peppering the islets with cannon fire. Finally, after the customary air and naval bombardment, the 3rd Battalion landed on Albert at 15:12 and the 2nd Battalion on Allen at 15:15. As both islets were quickly cleared, G Company landed on the unoccupied Andrew Island at 15:45, while the 1st and 2nd Battalions 14th Marines landed on Allen and Albert respectively. Then at 18:24, the 3rd Battalion launched an assault on the neighbouring Abraham Island, successfully securing the island by 19:15 and thus completing the chain surrounding Roi-Namur. This put an end to the first phase of the operation, and now the Americans had to prepare for the main landings. During the night, Arnold's artillery and Turner's warships continued to bombard Kwajalein and Burton, while 3 destroyers kept up an intermittent fire on Roi-Namur. Under cover of darkness, frogmen of the underwater demolition teams also reconnoitred Kwajalein and Roi-Namur's beaches and approaches, and found them clear of obstacles and mines, in what would be the first use of UDTs during the war. During the early hours of February 1st, Kwajalein was hit with an unprecedented pre-assault barrage. Over 36,000 rounds of naval gunfire and artillery, along with sizable air attacks, pummeled the island. Rockets and cannon fire from the LCI gunboats and 96 carrier-borne sorties also hit the island as the assault waves transferred to the Amtraks. At 0900, Turner released his landing force, with Colonel Curtis O'Sullivan's 184th Regiment heading towards Beach Red 1, while Colonel Mark Logie's 32nd Regiment advanced towards Beach Red 2. Each beach was covered by a strong point, but these had been largely obliterated, with only a few pillboxes surviving the heavy bombardment. Both regiments successfully landed at 0930 against weak opposition, at which point the artillery fire shifted to a zone 200 yards inland. Upon landing, however, the Americans were met with light mortar and automatic fire from a few undestroyed pillboxes, which briefly forced them to seek shelter behind the wreckage of a seawall, before they finally moved forward rapidly to seek out the enemy just beyond the beach. Behind them, the Amtraks were halted by seawall sections, craters, stumps and debris, which forced them to turn around instead of turning to the flanks, thus causing congestion as more Amtraks rolled in. The reef also halted later waves in LCVPs, so the troops had to wade ashore. In spite of these difficulties, the first 4 waves of both battalions were ashore within 15 minutes, and by 11:22, the leading battalions had pushed 150 yards inland against slight resistance. Facing almost no opposition, Logie's 1st Battalion then reached the western edge of the West Area Clearing by 11:30. O'Sullivan's 3rd Battalion, however, had to disable a network of pillboxes using white phosphorus smoke grenades before reaching the north-south sector of Wallace Road at 11:35. Moving forward, Logi's 1st Battalion then progressed against slight rifle and machine gun fire, with Company C pushing to a point 250 yards west of Wilmer Road by 12:20. Eventually this company would swing too far north and would have to be recalled at 1600. On Wheeler, meanwhile, the battalion was finally stopped at 13:30 by an organised network of pillboxes. Pushing tenaciously, Company A would manage to reach the important Wilmer Road an hour later. To the north, O'Sullivan's 3rd Battalion again found tougher resistance, but still managed to reach Wilmer Road by 14:50. Behind the 2 assault battalions, the follow-on battalions mopped up and the reserve battalions secured the beachheads. From Wheeler, Logi's 1st Battalion then had to fight through a series of Japanese strongpoints, while the 2nd Battalion passed through it to attack into Kwajalein's airfield. Luckily, no firm defensive position commanding the entire width of the island had been established. Instead, the bulk of the defenders had simply retired eastward after the death of Admiral Akiyama, who had left his bunker to observe the front line only to be killed by an artillery projectile. In the end, at 15:25, the 1st Battalion was relieved by the 2nd Battalion, which immediately began to reduce the defensive positions of the Canary strongpoint. To the north, O'Sullivan's 3rd Battalion ran at once upon large underground shelters and defences. Its advance was temporarily blockaded by a fuel dump ignited by artillery fire, but it eventually pushed on another 500 yards before halting at 1800 for the night. At the same time, Logi's 2nd Battalion also broke off its attack at a point halfway up the length of the unfinished runway, immediately organising defensive positions for the night. Yet a gap of 250 yards along the runway had been formed between the 2 regiments, so C Company 32nd Regiment would be sent to cover the area before dawn. The Japanese losses on Kwajalein at the close of the day's fighting were estimated at 500 killed and 11 captured, while the Americans only lost 21 dead and 87 wounded. Meanwhile, on Roi-Namur, because of the many difficulties faced on January 31st, Admiral Connolly's LSTs had entered the lagoon after first light to provide the Amtraks a shorter and smoother ride. In the meantime, naval ships, artillery and planes commenced their final softening up of the target. The Marines, however, were again struggling to transfer to the LVTs, so the assault would have to be delayed. Luckily, Colonel Lewis Jones's 23rd Marines reached the line of departure on time and started its run to Roi at 11:50. Covering them, amphibian tanks sought hull defilade positions and concentrated their 37mm fire on the Wendy Point blockhouse, which could deliver flanking fire on the assault waves. Hitting the beaches at 11:57, the 1st and 2nd Battalions landed with 2 companies abreast and immediately began the push to the 01 line, which ran across the island approximately 300 yards inland. In the meantime, Colonel Franklin Hart's 24th Marines had experienced even more difficulties before reaching the line of departure, so its landing would be further delayed. After a confusing reorganization of the assault waves, the 2nd and 3rd Battalions were sent forward to land on Namur. Hart's 2nd Battalion landed on Beach Green 2 at 11:55, with Company F on the right and Company E landing in confusion 5 minutes later in the centre with part of it behind F. As an anti-tank ditch blocked the narrow beach, there would be much congestion behind the assault companies. To the left, Hart's 3rd Battalion came ashore on Green 1 at 1200, with Companies K and I immediately attacking north. Companies E and F, however, crossed paths and became intermingled on the line, with a gap developing on the left flank between the 2 battalions. Consequently, part of Company G was sent to fill it, while Companies E and F moved forward against light resistance and reached the 01 line by 1300. Though Companies K and I faced heavier opposition, the Marines likewise pressed on and got to the 01 line by 1300. Meanwhile, Jones's battalions had rapidly reached the 01 line by 1217, while A Company secured Wendy Point, facing no opposition. Encouraged and relieved by the inconsequential resistance, the Marines began a disordered headlong dash across the island. Crossing the runway without orders and all guns blazing, tanks and infantry hastily charged in disorder, successfully driving the surviving Japanese north, but also leaving many bypassed defenders behind them. Eventually, Jones regained control over his units and managed to bring them back to the 01 line for a coordinated attack. The reassault of Roi, kicked off at 15:30, met only by a dazed enemy that was still recovering from the first attack. Thus, the 2nd Battalion on the right easily pushed north towards Estelle Point, while the 3rd Battalion moved towards Nancy Point. Enemy resistance was rapidly wiped out, with Estelle Point being secured by 1700, while Nancy Point was captured an hour later. At 1802, Jones finally declared Roi secure. In the meantime, Hart's battalions continued to consolidate on the 01 line in preparation for a coordinated attack. Unfortunately, about 1300, an assault team of Company F unknowingly breached a torpedo warhead bunker and began throwing satchel charges into the hole. Soon, the structure was obliterated in a massive explosion that also detonated 2 other ammunition bunkers nearby. As a result, blocks of concrete, palm trees, wood, torpedo warheads and other debris rained down over the island. Most of the island was immediately covered by a blast of smoke and dust, and 20 Marines were killed and 100 wounded. This explosion completely disrupted the attack of the 2nd Battalion, which was only able to pass the 01 line on the left. Hart's 3rd Battalion enjoyed more success, but it also faced heavier resistance, as the Japanese defenders were taking advantage of the rubble and dense brush. In the end, at 19:30, Hart ordered his battalions to dig in. During the night, the Japanese attempted to harass the Marines with probes, with the Green troops indiscriminately firing into the brush as a result. The following morning, with the support of light tanks, an enemy counterattack was beaten, and the Marines subsequently managed to advance 50 yards. Hart then launched his main attack at 0900, with the 3rd Battalion rapidly securing Nora Point by 1100. Tank support for the 2nd Battalion arrived an hour late, but still the 2nd Battalion managed to push towards Natalie Point by 12:15, where the 2 battalions finally met. Mopping up continued in the rear, and the island was declared secure at 14:18. For its first operation, Schmidt's 4th Marine Division suffered 206 killed, 617 wounded, and 181 missing. On the other hand, 3,472 Japanese were found dead, 51 were captured, and 40 Korean laborers also surrendered. Looking south, after a preparatory air, naval and artillery bombardment, Corlett launched a tank-supported coordinated attack at 07:15, with O'Sullivan's 2nd Battalion advancing on the north against weak resistance, while Logi's 2nd Battalion continued to fight through the Canary strongpoint. Moving through already smashed pillboxes with tanks leading, O'Sullivan's troops would be able to easily reach Carl Road on the eastern end of the airfield by 10:40. To the south, once Canary was reduced, Logi's forces were able to advance rapidly until they reached the perimeter of fire of the Cat strongpoint, where they once again had to fight through some tiers of well-concealed defensive works, until they finally got to Carl Road at 10:40. Yet the Americans were now in front of the main Japanese defense system on the island, with a deep tank trap lying immediately before Logi and connecting to the north with a long rifle trench that was to prove a headache for O'Sullivan. Furthermore, beyond the anti-tank ditch lay one of the most extensive and elaborately organized sets of defensive positions on the island. Thus, the 2 regiments prepared to begin the second stage of their attack on February 2nd. After a heavy artillery and air bombardment, Colonel Logi's 3rd Battalion moved forward with tanks leading at 1400. Although the assault initially pinned down the Japanese, with the American troops pushing across the wide tank barrier, the tanks found it impossible to get over the ditch. This impasse was finally broken when the tanks began to make their way along the ocean beach, and as they took the pillboxes in Korn strongpoint under fire, the infantry pushed forward and proceeded to destroy that strongpoint in detail. As such, Korn would be successfully reduced in about 35 minutes, and the objective Nora Road would be crossed. To the north, however, Colonel O'Sullivan's 2nd Battalion moved out at 12:45 without tank support, and soon had its advance stalled. Consequently, O'Sullivan had to organise night defences only 100 yards northeast of Carl Road, which also forced Logi to pull back to the abandoned trenches of Korn for the night. Heavy casualties were incurred during this day, with 11 dead and 241 wounded. But Japanese prisoners also reported only 200 to 300 defenders remaining, so a banzai charge was expected that night. Yet no attack would materialize, so General Corlett prepared his men for a new assault at 07:15. From this point, Kwajalein turned and narrowed for about 2,000 yards, so the axis of advance on February 3rd would have to be turned in great coordination. Preceded by preparatory fires, as was the previous day's attack, O'Sullivan's 1st Battalion led off on the left against light opposition, rapidly advancing about 250 yards until they reached the Admiralty area, a group of shattered buildings along the lagoon shore where it was believed that the Japanese had their headquarters. Among the wrecked buildings were several underground shelters with great earthen mounds above them and concrete blockhouses, intact and active. Against strong resistance, Company B would not be able to advance further. Company A, meanwhile, pushed further north and attempted to attack from the flank through the Admiralty area, but became bogged down. At the same time, Logie sent forward his 3rd Battalion, with Company I rapidly advancing along the coast, while Company K stopped to subdue a large concrete pillbox on the corner of the Admiralty area. By midday, Company I had reached Knoll Road and Company K had successfully bypassed the Admiralty area. Yet behind them there was a vertical gap, including most of the Admiralty area, between the two regiments. Thus, Corlett sent Logie's 1st Battalion to cover this gap, and he also sent O'Sullivan's 2nd Battalion to swing right and continue the advance north, while his 1st Battalion contained and neutralized the Admiralty area. At 13:30, the new attack was launched, with Logie's 3rd Battalion rapidly smashing into the Knapp strongpoint, while O'Sullivan's 1st Battalion concentrated on the Admiralty area and his 2nd Battalion attacked north towards Knob Pier. Although the initial movement of O'Sullivan's 2nd Battalion was disorganized, the Americans managed to cross Knoll Road against heavy rifle fire, which eventually forced them to stop by nightfall, after making some progress. Meanwhile, the 1st Battalion launched a coordinated attack towards the lagoon, with the support of tanks, and gradually began to destroy the pillboxes and blockhouses of the Admiralty area, successfully reaching the lagoon by 1800. And to the east, Logie's Company I rapidly managed to reduce the weakly defended Knapp strongpoint, and then pushed forward to the objective, Nathan Road, with haste. Yet the other companies made slower progress against stronger defences, and would not be able to reach the objective before nightfall. Nonetheless, about 1,000 yards had been gained on February 3rd, with the Americans estimating to have killed around 1,300 Japanese, more than were expected to still be on the island, at the cost of 54 dead and 255 wounded. After sunset, several Japanese counterattacks and infiltration attempts were carried out against the steadfast Americans, yet all of them ended in failure. As such, Corlett expected to end the enemy resistance on February 4th, yet his plans were based on the assumption that his 2 regiments had reached Nathan Road, even though they hadn't. Additionally, far too many small pockets remained in the rear, and the reserve battalions were experiencing difficulties routing them out. Corlett's final plan was for Logie's 1st Battalion to clear the remainder of the island, so Companies C, B and A would be deployed with great difficulty to attack through O'Sullivan's 2nd Battalion and Logie's 3rd Battalion. Unbeknownst to him, O'Sullivan also directed his 2nd Battalion to attack towards Knob Pier in order to complete the unfinished task of the previous day. At 07:15, Corlett's final attack, supported by tanks, was launched. In the east, Logie's Companies A and B were immediately involved in a full-scale battle with the Japanese who had been bypassed the day before, and who now poured heavy fire on the companies as they advanced towards the line of departure. It was not until 10 o'clock that 2 of the 1st Battalion companies reached the lines held by the 3rd Battalion. Then the Americans began to attack in disorganized condition, but successfully managed to advance 200 yards past Nathan Road, where the advance was stopped pending relief. Meanwhile, to the west, the attack of O'Sullivan's 2nd Battalion, supported by Company B, prevented the advance of Logie's C Company until 11 o'clock. Thankfully, the Americans managed to push towards Knob Pier by 1300, where they found no enemy resistance. Behind them, the lagoon shore continues to be mopped up, surprisingly showcasing a considerable number of Japanese and Koreans surrendering. Finally, at 1345, Logie's 2nd Battalion passed through the 1st to complete the assault along Kwajalein. These troops would successfully push to the island's northern tip, blasting through the remaining Japanese camouflaged dugouts and ruined concrete blockhouses. At long last, Company G would reach Nero Point at 15:15, but Company F, however, would methodically destroy the enemy positions until they finally secured Kwajalein's northern end at 19:20. Losses during the last day were 252 wounded, although they only reported 65 Japanese killed and over 100 captured. Thus, for the Battle of Kwajalein Island, the Americans suffered a total of 142 killed, 845 wounded, and 2 missing, killing around 4,300 Japanese and capturing another 166. The operation had been a model one in almost every respect. The attacking force had achieved strategic surprise, artillery preparation, naval gunfire, and aerial bombardment had softened up the target in a fashion unexcelled at any other time in the Pacific War. The ship-to-shore movement had been conducted expeditiously and without serious hitch. Supplies flowed ashore and to the front lines smoothly and without interruption. The infantry engineer teams, assisted by tanks, moved steadily, if somewhat more slowly than had been anticipated, up the axis of the island, clearing the enemy from shelters and pillboxes, and American casualties had been light. Altogether, the battle for Kwajalein represented the ideal for all military operations, a good plan ably executed. To complete the conquest of the southern Kwajalein Islands, detachments of amphibian tanks had been landed on Buster and Byron on February 3rd. Troops of the 2nd Battalion, 17th Regiment landed on Burnett and Blankenship on February 4th. The chain between Ashbury and Bennett was secured on February 5th. On the same day, Clement, Clarence and Clifford Islands were quickly secured, although at Clifford a force of 101 Japanese would have to be killed. Beverly, Benson and Berlin were also secured on February 5th, with 119 Japanese dead on the latter, and Bennett fell against the 7th Reconnaissance Troop and O'Sullivan's 3rd Battalion that same day, with 94 Japanese killed. Most importantly, Colonel Zimmerman's 1st and 3rd Battalions landed on Burton's Beach Orange 4 on the morning of February 3rd after a heavy artillery, air and naval bombardment. Upon landing, the 1st Battalion traversed the southern end of the island against weak resistance, and then began to push north, supported by tanks, ultimately getting stopped by strong enemy resistance at Bailey Pier. The following morning, the assault was resumed, with the 1st Battalion rapidly breaking through towards the airfield, thanks to the heavy air bombardment of the Japanese pillboxes. At 11:30, the 3rd Battalion then relieved them and continued the advance north against meagre resistance, ultimately reaching Burton's northern tip by 12:10. After this, the last of the enemy were readily mopped up, and by 13:37 the island was fully secured. During this battle, the 17th Regiment lost 7 killed and 82 wounded, while reporting 450 Japanese dead. Meanwhile, to the north, the 25th Marines occupied some 55 islands in the northern part of the atoll between February 2nd and 7th, finding absolutely no enemy resistance. With Kwajalein Atoll finally secured, the next objective in the Marshalls for Admirals Nimitz and Spruance would be none other than Eniwetok, where Major General Nishida Yoshimi was preparing his men to fight to the last. Accompanying the capture of the Kwajalein Atoll, the main Japanese base in the Marshall Islands, the Americans had also successfully neutralized every air and naval base in the island group. Among these were Jaluit, Mille, Wotje and Maloelap, which had sizable Japanese garrisons but would not be invaded by the Allied forces. Since the Japanese were cut off from outside assistance, the garrisons were doing no harm to the Allied effort, so they would be left alone, thus saving many American and Japanese lives by not forcing the issue. Only the Eniwetok Atoll would not be bypassed, for it had the 2nd largest lagoon in the Marshall Islands. Consequently, Admiral Nimitz knew it would be necessary to capture this atoll to give shelter to all the ships he intended to send westwards in the drive against the Japanese Inner Empire. As Majuro was rapidly captured, and the fighting at Roi-Namur and Kwajalein indicated that Brigadier General Thomas Watson's 8,000 reserve troops would not be needed, Admirals Spruance and Hill had immediately begun to prepare for the invasion of Eniwetok right on the heels of Kwajalein. Because Eniwetok was within Truk's air combat radius, however, the Americans intended to neutralize what they called the Gibraltar of the Pacific with a carrier strike prior to Eniwetok's D-Day. The success of Operation Hailstone, as it was called, would also determine whether Truk needed to be taken, or like Rabaul and Maloelap, it could be bypassed. This operation would be bigger than December's raid on Kwajalein, using 3 carrier task groups for a grand total of 5 fleet carriers and 3 light carriers, and 1 striking force under Admiral Lee that included 6 battleships and 1 light carrier. 10 submarines also lurked outside Truk, operating independently to intercept fleeing Japanese warships and rescue US Navy flyers downed during the attack. In preparation for this strike, on February 4th, a lone PB-4Y Liberator lifted off from Torokina Airfield to carry out an aerial reconnaissance of Truk. As a result, the Marine aircraft successfully photographed Truk's major land-based installations and discovered that Truk Lagoon was filled with warships before returning back to Bougainville. The reconnaissance overflight also alerted Admiral Koga that a heavy raid was imminent, so he ordered all his warships to depart the lagoon before February 21st, the predicted date of the incoming strike. Thus, by February 12th, most of the Combined Fleet's major units had left Truk for Palau, leaving only the 4th Fleet's light cruisers and destroyers and various ships from other fleets, including the 6th Fleet's headquarters. That day, Sperance's fast carrier task groups departed the newly established anchorage at Majuro, rapidly steaming north of Eniwetok and then making a high-speed run southwest to finally arrive at an attack point 90 miles northeast of Doblon before sunrise on February 17th. The roundabout path would successfully allow the Americans to avoid detection prior to the attack, and at 0443, Operation Hailstone finally opened with 5 fleet carriers launching a total of 72 F-6F Hellcats. Their mission was to knock out enemy air power prior to sending in the bombers, a new technique developed by Admiral Mitzcher himself. The morning attack caught the Japanese completely unprepared, as no aircraft were in the air when radar detected the incoming fighters. Despite this, the Japanese managed to launch 90 planes, half of which attempted to intercept the US fighters without coordination. Consequently, 30 of them were shot down in the opening minutes of the engagement, and 55 would be shot down in total, against only 4 Hellcats lost. Having swept the skies of opposition by 0600, the Hellcats then strafed the seaplane base at Doblon and the airfields on Moen, Eten and Param, successfully destroying another 40 aircraft on the ground. As the fighter sweep was ending, 18 Avengers appeared to drop their deadly load on the airfields, and thus finish the job of neutralizing Truk's air power. As such, the living hell created by strafing and bombs saw a total of 125 operational aircraft and 110 air arsenal aircraft get destroyed or seriously damaged on the ground. With Truk's air power neutralized, the next American objective was the shipping in the lagoon, so the carriers then began launching full deckload strikes, staggering the launches so that there were aircraft over Truk virtually continuously for the rest of the day. Due to the lack of air cover or warning, many merchant ships were caught at anchor, with only the island's anti-aircraft guns for defense. At 0730, the first shipping began to be attacked, with Yorktown's bombers rapidly sinking the cargo ship Fujikawa Maru and then bombing the submarine tender Rio de Janeiro Maru, which sank the next day. Another submarine tender that was hit was the Heian Maru, headquarters of Vice Admiral Takagi Takio. Damaged by 2 bomb hits, the ship would successfully survive the relentless American attacks, then offloading Takagi on Doblon after sunset. At 0923, Lee's battleships, heavy cruisers and destroyers were also sent on an around-the-atoll cruise to catch escaping ships. Some Japanese vessels attempted to flee via the atoll's North Pass, but bottled up by the aerial attack and by Lee's warships, most of them would be successfully sunk by 1300. 5 ships that managed to escape the lagoon then sailed into Lee's battleships at 1330 and were rapidly sunk in the uneven surface combat that followed. Only the destroyer Noaki, probably with the safety valves of its boilers tied down, managed to outrun the American vessels, firing a spread of torpedoes to discourage close pursuit. The result of the first day of Hailstone would be more than 20 ships sunk, but during the night the Japanese retaliated by sending small groups of radar-equipped B-5Ns from Param Airfield. One of them managed to approach Mitzcher's carriers by evading the American patrol fighters and ultimately got to torpedo the Intrepid, which suffered moderate damage and was immediately sent back to the Marshalls. The Americans then launched their own night attack on Japanese shipping in the Truk Atoll, sending 12 radar-equipped Avengers from Enterprise to make radar-guided night attacks. In about 30 minutes, the Avengers would make 25 passes over Doblon at Eten, scoring 13 direct hits on ships, 2 on rocky islets mistaken for ships, and 7 near misses. As a result, around 12 vessels were sunk during the attack, including the Heian Maru. It was a remarkable performance by a dozen aircraft in the US Navy's first carrier-launched night attack. To complete the operation, Mitzcher then sent another fighter sweep at dawn, which had no effect because the Japanese didn't have any surviving aircraft in the area, and then sent more air waves to sink the crippled ships in the harbour and to destroy Truk's shore installations. By noon, Japanese resistance was almost non-existent, and there were no more worthwhile targets, so Spruance and Mischa decided to call a halt to the attacks, as it was considered that Truk no longer posed a threat to the Eniwetok invasion. American losses were 12 fighters, 7 torpedo bombers, 6 dive bombers, and 2 float planes downed, 29 aircrew lost, and 28 dead on the Intrepid. The Americans, meanwhile, reported 10 Japanese warships and 30 transports sunk, including 5 tankers. Many others were damaged but managed to escape. A total of 137,000 tons of Japanese merchant shipping was lost, of which 44,000 tons came from Japan's tanker fleets. The combined fleet would never return to Truk. The 4th Fleet headquarters remained at Truk, but its ships left, and the transports carrying the 52nd Division to Truk, some of which arrived on February 19th, hastily unloaded and quickly departed. Vice Admiral Kobayashi Masumi was further made responsible for this defeat, and would consequently be relieved of his command, never to return to active duty. Operation Hailstone also showed that Truk could be easily neutralized, and that there was no need for a costly invasion. Thus, in March, Truk's planned invasion was cancelled, and those resources would be committed to the Marianas landings instead. After the successful neutralization of Truk Atoll and the rapid capture of Kwajalein, the Americans were finally ready to launch the invasion of Eniwetok, codenamed Operation Catchpole. With only 12 days planning, the invasion force would be assembled in a 7-day period. As a result, Admiral Hill had at his disposal 5 attack transports, 1 transport, 2 attack cargo ships, 1 cargo ship, 1 LSD, 2 APDs, 6 LCIs, and 9 LSTs to carry General Watson's Tactical Group 1, mainly formed by the 22nd Marines and the 106th Regiment. In support would be the 3 battleships, 3 heavy cruisers, and 7 destroyers of Rear Admiral Jesse Oldendorf, the 3 escort carriers and 3 destroyers of Rear Admiral Van Ragsdale, and the carrier group of Rear Admiral Samuel Gainder. The plan was to first land 2 scout companies on Camellia, Cana, and Zinia Islands, in order to bring 2 artillery battalions to support the next day's attack on Engebe, which would be carried out by 2 battalions of Colonel John Walker's 22nd Marines. Then, Colonel Russell Ayer's 106th Regiment would land on Eniwetok Island, and once it was captured, the infantry was to take Parry Island along with the 22nd Marines. Against them, General Nishida's 1st Amphibious Brigade had been recently brought to the atoll, with its headquarters, 250 IGN personnel, and some 1,115 troops on Parry, about 692 soldiers, 500 IGN personnel, and 61 men of the 61st Guard Unit protecting Engebe, and only 779 troops holding Eniwetok. In the 6 weeks following the Kwajalein assault, the Japanese had been constructing defences on the lagoon side based on reports they received from the Kwajalein attack, yet there was not enough time to make much progress. On February 15th, as Hill's expeditionary group sailed from Kwajalein Lagoon, the Americans successfully carried out Operation Hailstone, the neutralization of Truk. But meanwhile, Gainder's carriers proceeded directly to Eniwetok on February 16th and launched a series of preliminary strikes that completely destroyed all buildings in the atoll, rendered the airfield at Engebe temporarily useless, and destroyed 14 aircraft on the ground. Naval shelling of Engebe, Eniwetok, Parry, and Gilbert Islands began in the early morning hours of February 17th, to be joined by more airstrikes after dawn. At the same time, Hill's attack forces arrived off the southeast coast of Eniwetok Atoll, soon reaching its first stations in the northern part of the lagoon. As the larger warships blasted the main islands, some destroyers bombarded Camellia and Cana to allow the Amtraks carrying the Amphibious Reconnaissance Company to land by 1330. Finding them unoccupied, the scouts would secure both islands by 1400. This would permit Hill to land his 2 artillery battalions in order to support the Engebe assault, which was found to be clear of obstacles and mines by UDT-1 Frogmen. In the meantime, Company D, 4th Tank Battalion, secured Zinia and 4 other islets west of Engebe in the early morning of February 18th, so the first phase of the operation was completed on schedule. Consequently, after preparatory shelling and bombing, which detonated the main ammunition dump on Engebe, Colonel Walker's assault Amtraks began their advance towards the island, covered by the support fire of LCI gunboats. The latter's rockets fell short, however, and the resulting spray and smoke forced some Amtraks off course, while other Amtraks also broke down because of their heavy use at Kwajalein. But despite this, the assault waves hit the beach at 0843, with both battalions successfully landing on Engebi's central southwest shore. On the left, the 2nd Battalion pushed forward rapidly, bypassing isolated points of resistance and quickly overrunning the airfield by 10:30. Company F in particular managed to swing towards Weasel Point on the west corner with remarkable speed. Meanwhile, on the right, the 1st Battalion quickly split, with Company A driving north to New Point and Company C towards Skunk Point on the southeast corner. The Japanese would put up a stiff fight against them, as their spider hole defences on the gap between the two companies were covered by the dense brush and palms. As a result, the 3rd Battalion would be landed at 0955 and would be sent with tanks to clear the various tunnels and covered foxholes that resisted them. Thus, the Japanese were slowly forced northward along the island's eastern shore, eventually being isolated and cut down. By 1310, Weasel and Newt points had been cleared, and at 1450, about 6 hours after the initial landing, General Watson declared the island secured. 6 minutes later, Company C seized Skunk Point, and by 1830, the 1st Battalion secured their half of Engebi. The assault had been executed so quickly that even the experienced IJA defenders were unable to offer any meaningful organised resistance. Bypassed Japanese troops and infiltrators caused difficulties through the night, but mopping up continued, and Engebi was formally secured at 0800 on February 19th. American losses were 85 dead and missing, and 521 wounded, against the 1,280 Japanese killed and 16 taken prisoner. For the assault on Eniwetok, however, new intelligence indicated that the island was more heavily defended than expected, so Watson would reinforce the 106th Regiment with Walker's Reserve 3rd Battalion and some Marine tanks. Therefore, Colonel Ayers' new plan was to land his 2 battalions abreast, with the 3rd Battalion establishing a covering line to block off the eastern end of Eniwetok, while the 1st Battalion cleared its western end. For the assault, the infantrymen lacked field artillery support, and although Eniwetok had also been subjected to naval fire on February 18th, it had only received a fraction of the bombardment targeted against Engebi and Parry. At 0810 on February 19th, carrier planes began to bomb and strafe the beaches, and LCI gunboats followed with a last-minute rocket saturation of the landing area. Meanwhile, although the arrival of Marine tanks was delayed by choppy seas and a 9-foot embankment just inland halted the amphibian tanks, the Americans would manage to hit the yellow beaches at 0916. Upon landing, on the left, Company L pivoted east along the pier, while Company K pushed across the island to reach the opposite coast at 10:30. On the right, however, the 1st Battalion encountered dense spider hole defences, as Companies C and B attempted to push across the island, while Company A attacked southwest along the coast. At noon, therefore, the front line of the 1st Battalion was in the shape of an S, extending from the lagoon to the ocean. Unexpectedly, to meet the American attack after it penetrated the island further east, the Japanese abandoned all but the most important positions and sent around 400 men to deliver a counterattack. Well out of sight, they moved east in the brush on the southern side of the road, and when they came to the American line shortly after noon, struck it on both sides of the trail. At some points, the Japanese actually broke through before they were cut down, but eventually the attacks were beaten back by 12:45, though American casualties were high. Due to the strong resistance encountered, Ayers decided to order his 3rd Battalion to attack east, and immediately landed the reserve Marines to relieve the left half of the 1st Battalion line. In the meantime, the infantrymen resumed the attack west, slowly gaining some ground near the lagoon. By 1425, the 3rd Battalion 22nd Marines had successfully landed, passing through Ayers' 1st Battalion 1 hour later. Both battalions would then launch a concerted attack towards the southwest end at 1515. Yet the Marines would soon lag behind, their advance delayed by the rugged terrain and the lack of adequate illumination and tank support. While the fight for Eniwetok was underway, the amphibious reconnaissance company would occupy Japtan by nightfall after first securing 10 unoccupied islets on the atoll's eastern rim, while the scout tank battalion secured 8 islets on Eniwetok's eastern rim, successfully subduing the enemy resistance on Regilly. This would allow Watson to have some much-needed artillery support for the Parry attack. To deny the enemy the opportunity for their customary aggressive night tactics, Ayers at 1850 ordered that the attack be pressed during the night. At 03:33 on February 20th, Ayaz's 1st Battalion therefore managed to reach the western end of the island, though the Marines were still 100 yards to their left rear. The Japanese, meanwhile, attempted to probe and infiltrate through the night, finally counterattacking at 09:10. The attacks were fought off, however, and the advance to the coast continued as the Marines ran into a final stronghold, which required tanks and self-propelled guns to reduce it. By 1445, the stronghold was finally reduced, and the western end of Eniwetok was at last secured. To the east, Ayaz's 3rd Battalion also attempted to continue its attack during the night. But this proved futile, as the troops lacked the confidence and experience for such a difficult task. As such, the battalion halted at 04:30, about a third of the way from the island's north end. Cautiously renewing the attack at 0700 on February 21st, the infantrymen would slowly but surely continue the advance until they finally reached the north end at 16:30. Thus, the island was finally declared secure at 1721, with the Americans losing 37 killed and 94 wounded against 800 Japanese killed and 23 taken prisoner. Because action had been bogged down at Eniwetok, the assault on Parry was delayed until the island was reduced, and Walker's 3rd Battalion could re-embark as the regimental reserve. In the meantime, bombs and naval and artillery shells had pounded the target for 3 days, while the rest of the 22nd Marines were brought from Engebe to southern Eniwetok. For the last assault of the operation, Walker's plan was to land 2 battalions abreast directly against the defenders' strongpoints, and after seizing the beachhead, tanks and infantry were to press forward to the ocean side of the island. The preliminary naval and air bombardment of Parry opened at dawn on February 22nd, closely followed at 0600 by fire from the field artillery battalions at Eniwetok and Jeptan. During the naval shelling, the destroyers were firing by radar because the island was thickly shrouded in smoke and blowing directly west into the assault waves. This caused a mishap to occur as 3 LCI gunboats were damaged by 5-inch rounds while approaching the island, thus forcing them to retire after they unleashed their barrage of rockets. At 0900, Walker's 1st and 2nd Battalions successfully landed against heavy machine gun fire, albeit 200 yards further south than intended because of the smoke. Thankfully, shells from the amphibian tanks managed to silence the Japanese guns, which allowed the Americans to move inland and to land their medium tanks behind the battalions. It was at this point that 3 dug-in Japanese light tanks decided to attack, rather than earlier when the infantry were vulnerable. Yet the Shermans immediately destroyed them before they inflicted any damage, so Walker's battalions would be allowed to push forward against the retreating enemy. While Companies G and F swung left to reach the north end by 1330, Company E drove straight across to reach the ocean shore by 1200. Then, as the Marines were consolidating, a group of 200 Japanese were discovered marching north and were wiped out in minutes. On the right, Company B reached the ocean coast at 1155, while Companies C and A swung south towards the 01 line just south of the Valentine Pier, successfully reaching it by 1330. Walker's Reserve 3rd Battalion also landed at 10, immediately moving south, while clearing bypassed enemy pockets to finally take up position on the right half of the 01 line. After a short artillery barrage, the attack south was launched at 1330. Pressing through thick underbrush, both battalions achieved rapid progress as they overran a series of trench and foxhole defences. The battalions were 450 yards from the island's southern tip when they halted for the night, but regardless, Walker decided to declare the end of enemy resistance at 1930. Only slight enemy activity with occasional sniping remained, which would be swiftly cleared by 0930 on February 23rd. For the capture of Parry, Marine casualties were 73 dead and missing and 261 wounded against 1,300 Japanese killed, including General Nishida, and 66 captured. In total, American casualties during the Battle of Eniwetok came to 313 killed, 879 wounded, and 77 missing. On the other hand, the Japanese lost their entire garrison, with 3,380 killed and 105 captured. After the end of the battle, the 22nd Marines returned to Kwajalein, while the 10th Defence Battalion and the 3rd Army Defence Battalion garrisoned the atoll. Between March 7th and April 5th, Walker would then conduct Operation Flintlock Jr., carrying out 29 successful landings, securing 14 mostly unoccupied atolls, and killing over 100 Japanese at the cost of 2 Marines killed. Other detachments would finally occupy the Erekub, Or, and Ujalang atolls by the end of April, leaving only Mile, Maloelap, Jaluit, and Wutja bypassed and unoccupied, in addition to the Japanese presence at Kosrae, Wake, and Nauru. The fall of Eniwetok signified the end of the Gilbert and Marshall Islands campaign, in which the American forces unsurprisingly emerged victorious. As a result, the important atolls of Makin, Tarawa, Majuro, Kwajalein, and Eniwetok were successfully secured, thus leaving the remaining Japanese-held atolls and the island chains completely neutralized and isolated, unable to receive any trickle of supplies, and with their bypassed garrisons slowly losing their fighting strength with each passing day. Yet the campaign hadn't been a picnic for the Allied forces either. During the invasion of the Gilberts, the unprepared Americans suffered heavy casualties against the ferocious defenders, but they ultimately destroyed the enemy in gruesome fighting by sheer force of numbers. However, the blood of their comrades taught the Americans several valuable lessons that they would apply during the invasion of the Marshalls with great effect. Nevertheless, by the end of the Gilbert and Marshall Islands campaign, the Americans had lost approximately 5,100 killed or missing and 6,700 wounded, further suffering the loss of the escort carrier Liscombe Bay. In turn, the Japanese lost around 21,000 dead and 375 captured, as well as 10 warships and 30 transports sunk during Operation Hailstone. After the Gilberts and Marshalls were taken, the Allies built naval bases, fortifications, and airfields on the islands to prepare for an assault on the Marianas. Eniwetok in particular would serve as the main fleet anchorage base for the upcoming invasions and carrier operations, including the second phase of the island-hopping campaign. On the other hand, the Japanese defeat forced military leaders to draw back to a new defensive perimeter, the Absolute National Defense Line, which included the Marianas and Palos. Thus, these islands would be heavily fortified to contest the Allied advance toward the Philippines. Though the Americans had achieved an amazing victory in the Central Pacific, much fighting still remained to be done in the area, so expect to see the continuation of the island-hopping campaign in the near future. More long-form videos and more videos on the Pacific War are on the way, so make sure you are subscribed and have pressed the bell button to see them. Please consider liking, subscribing, commenting, and sharing, it helps immensely. Our patrons and YouTube members can watch more than 300 exclusive videos. Join their ranks via the link in the description or by pressing the join button under the video to watch these weekly videos, learn about our schedule, get early access to our videos, access our private Discord, and much more. This is the Kings and Generals channel, and we will catch you on the next one.